Hi, I'm Lisa Gonzales, Chief Business Officer here in the Mount Diablo Unified School District. And in this week's episode of Ask the CBO, we're going to be focusing in on the CARES Act. So we're going to go ahead and set the stage, explain what we've received, and then how it's been spent. And today I'm going to be joined by Mike Berg. He's our fiscal advisor from the Contra Costa County Office of Education. He's been our fiscal advisor since about this time last year. And the reason that the county office sent him in is because our second budget check-in for the year, which is known as our second interim, it identified our budget as qualified. That means that you can't meet your financial obligations for at least one of the 3 years where we show our budget. So, Mike, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. And in order to really set the stage, what we need to do is we need to go back for just a second to March of 2020. So in March of last year, we had reduced close to $20 million of a $21.1 million goal that the board gave us in an attempt to raise salaries for staff and to begin to address our structural deficit. And then on March 13th, we closed schools for students and staff because of the pandemic. So let's talk for a second about the cost of living adjustment so that we can see how the amount has changed, especially over the last year and a half. So the cost of living adjustment, otherwise known as the COLA, the C-O-L-A, it's the cost of doing business, and that cost of doing business increases every year. It's really important for us to monitor because every year staff move up on the salary schedule. Many of them earn longevity benefits or stipends. Medical, dental, vision costs increase. Electricity and insurance go up. And really, if we just keep the same staff and the same site and department budgets, our expenses would go up about $12 million a year. So let's go back to June of 2019 for just a minute, because we're always required to look at our budget current year and 2 years ahead. So in June of 2019, the COLA for this current school year was estimated to be 3%. For us, that equates to about $8.5 million. In January of 2020, so just about a year ago, it was dropped to 2.29%, which for us is about $6.6 million. You can see the difference there between the 8.5 and the 6.6. In February, it was increased just a tad in the estimates and the conversations coming out of Sacramento to 2.31%. But then by the end of June of last year, it was down to 0, which means our cost of doing business is about $12.75 million increase a year. We were expecting to get 8.5 and we didn't. Mike?
What's important about this, and Dr. Gonzales alluded to this, is I've been asked to work with the district by the County Office of Education because they do have a structural deficit in the budget, which means more money is going out than is coming in. That has been going on for a number of years, to the point that it has eroded the reserve below what is acceptable and compliant with state regulation. What's happening now is a compounding of that, where the state had projected in June of 2019 to provide $8.5 million to address the $12.75 million traditional and expected increase per year to the district, still exacerbating the problem by over $4 million. Now they're sending, or they sent 0, which means the $12.75 million compounding of the problem. Bottom line, less money coming in than money going out. And this is without adding teachers. This is without adding staff. This is without adding new students. In fact, students are reducing, which ultimately reduces revenue. This is the fundamental definition of the budget problem and the structural deficit that Mount Diablo is realizing today, and why the rest of this presentation, I think, will explain how the CARES Act helped, but it didn't resolve the problem.
So let's just take a look for a minute at the CARES Act rules. And these rules were shared by the US Treasury. I know chief business officers around the state and nation have all seen these rules. And they were reiterated by school services in an article that they wrote in September called Spend Your Federal Funds Wisely. So CARES Act allows you to maintain staff who could have been laid off because there were no students here or because we didn't receive that COLA. So think about positions that might not have been needed if there were no students at school, positions like bus drivers or bus assistants, noon supervisors or campus monitors, some of our food service workers, even some of the custodial work if you don't have students on campus. Think about things like pandemic related enrollment drops and the fact that the state didn't send the 8.5 million, support for distance learning, other things that we wouldn't have been able to pay for because of our structural deficit and our very tight budget. You know, things like PPEs. We're able to take a look at work that is new and substantially different, including planning and preparation time for our teachers to be providing stronger instructional programs to meet the needs of students, particularly in distance learning. Technology, hardware, software, security. All of these are allowable expenses, and they are all tied back to our learning continuity plan. Likewise, we are all on speed dial with our auditors because our auditors give us that check and balance to say, what about this? Yes, that works. No, it doesn't. Here's what the Treasury Department says. And so none of these decisions have been made in isolation. They've been made and reviewed over and over by our executive cabinet. So let's jump for a second into what our district received as far as mitigation, learning loss, CARES Act funding. And what I want you to take a look at is that picture there on the right side, because you're going to hear two different amounts of money. So first of all, we have the learning continuity and attendance plan. There was $19.78 million comprised of three different pots of money. And this was part of a plan that we presented to the board in September that was approved. And that said, here's how we plan on spending these funds. This is our outline of what we are going to do. And that comprised the $19 million. And then what you have is you have this big topic that everybody talks about, which is the CARES Act funds. It takes the three pots of money that you see there up at the top, the governor's emergency relief, the coronavirus relief, the governor's resource, and it adds to it another federal pot of money called ESSER, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Relief. ESSER 1, that was announced in summer and fall of last year. So you see 19 million in learning continuity, total CARES Act is 24 million. There's also been a question that many of you had about how much have we received. So out of the 24 million of CARES Act funds, we have received $19.5 million. That means that $19.5 million has been logged in our ledger. It's cash that has come in that we have available in the county treasury that we can use. We have not received the total 24 million because it is dispersed quarterly. Some of these pots of money are dispersed quarterly, which means we expect to get more in the end of March and in the end of June. Mike, you want to give it the economist spin for a second?
I do. I think there are a couple of really important points here. Number one, just fundamental definition, the school's budget is not money. The school's budget is nothing more than a plan that projects or anticipates these cash apportionments coming periodically through the year. And the regular cash apportionments come roughly equal increments every month. The CARES Act and these funds we're talking about today only come quarterly. The importance of that in any environment, whether it's your personal finances, your business, or even school finance, is that you can't spend what you don't have. And so that budget plan that speaks to the projected revenues that will arrive is often misunderstood. Many people say, gosh, you have a $300 million budget. We have $300 million to spend. No, you don't. You have a percentage of that throughout the year, and you have to feed that out at the same pace it comes in. Where a district gets in trouble, no different than a business or a person would get in trouble, is if you're spending more than you make. Yeah, on a personal level, I'm dipping into my savings account to make my monthly bills. At some point, I'm going to run out of savings account and have a problem. That's exactly the environment Mount Diablo is in. They've been spending their savings account for a number of years. That's what we call a structural deficit. And now there is no choice under Assembly Bill 1200, which is the statute under which I've been deployed to the district. There's no choice but for the district not only to spend only what they receive, but actually to spend less to correct that structural deficit.
So let's jump into the CARES Act and let's just talk for a second about what the CARES Act enabled us to do. So to start with, it was intended to save jobs and prevent layoffs. It was intended to provide technology, PPEs, cleaning products, plexiglass barriers, gloves, masks, and really anything that we needed in order to open our schools back up again to welcome students in for learning. We used the funds to develop engaging, distance-supported instructional programs for students and to focus on the areas that were identified in the Learning Continuity Plan and in the LCAP, which is our Local Control Accountability Plan. I know a lot of acronyms, I'm sorry. But really, these funds were intended to provide relief in a year where we were not provided COLA and a number of other things.
Quickly, I just want to touch on that slide and why some people might look at that slide and that information and say, well, if this is what the money was for, and if school wasn't in session, why didn't the district and why don't districts across the state consider reducing staff? Because obviously if kids aren't in school and those school day only employees, those hourly employees don't have a function that day, wouldn't it be easier to reduce staff and therefore reduce the burden on the budget? That's a good portion of why the CARES Act was passed, because the state also passed emergency statute that said people still need to be paid, people still need to be able to pay their personal bills and live their lives. And so the district's expense burden did not go down. Employees were not laid off. Even part-time employees were still paid for their part-time work, even though they weren't necessarily having to come to work. So this is a really unusual environment where, despite the fact the workload did decrease, the expenditures did not. And that's why the CARES Act were essential to backfill for the expenses we still had.
What I'm going to do in these next few slides here is I'm going to talk about these different buckets of money, because every one of them has different rules, different timelines. They all have a reporting component. They have different allowances. Some of them have the same ones, some are different. And so one of the things that we did with some of our funds for CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, we maintained close to $2 million worth of bus driver positions, some of whom right now we are grateful because we're able to keep meal deliveries going out to students. That is new and substantially different work. We have substitutes for custodial and other grounds positions, particularly for individuals who take COVID leaves, because it's really important to understand that across the district, anyone who takes a COVID leave, those leaves are not funded by the state or the federal government. So if someone took a leave for childcare, for medical, to take care of a family member, we had to pay 100% of the costs of those individuals that needed to come in to fill those positions. We have an agreement with our teachers union, whereby our teachers at the elementary level are required to provide an amount between 60 and 120 minutes of live daily interaction, depending on the grade level, and on Wednesdays, 30 to 60 minutes. You know, this time has been focused on learning, connecting, and engaging to support students through print and digital content. And during distance learning, you know, our members are supposed to be providing those minimal numbers of minutes, but they're not required to do any more, because the additional time that we've worked on with them is to focus on things like preparation time, progress monitoring, grading, small group instruction, meetings, training, collaborating with colleagues and peers, distance learning preparation, professional development, communicating with families. Because that time is new and substantially different, we are able to use CARES Act funds to pay for a portion of their day that is now dedicated to this new and different work that wouldn't have existed outside of a pandemic. So for example, some of our elementary grade teachers have anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 hours a day of this time. So that's an example of some of the funds that we've used. With our drop in enrollment of over 1,100 students, we're currently staffed with more than 40 teachers in the district that we would have reduced this year in order to really make sure that our staffing tied to our enrollment. But because we did not eliminate those positions, and as a matter of fact, in some situations actually hired additional teachers based on some of our needs, we also faced the uncertainty of not knowing when the distance learning phase was actually going to end. But we were able to fund those positions through the CARES Act because the pandemic resulted in lower enrollment, if you will. We funded our school and nutrition program for the loss of funds last spring when, as a result of the pandemic, the department wasn't able to sell food. So all the meals that it had stocked up, refrigerators, freezers, you name it, ready to go with those products, they weren't able to sell all of those. And so we used some of the funds for that. We have technology staff members who spent months and months and months and continue to assist students and parents and staff with connecting online from their homes, purchasing, assisting, and tracking and delivering hotspots. These are new and substantially different responsibilities that would not have been there if it hadn't been for a pandemic. And while we continue to place orders for Chromebooks and teacher laptops, the CARES Act has been used to reduce the cost of Chromebooks at some school sites and to purchase them devices for sites that really have minimal funds in their budgets to be able to do that. And since we don't have a pot of district funds or what we often call a refresh plan for technology, the CARES Act funds were able to provide what many of the sites in the district would otherwise not have been able to cover. So we've kept this slide up so that you could see all of these, and we will also put this on the business services website.
So is it fair to say, Dr. Gonzales, that while these monies are in addition to what you had in the general fund, number one, your general fund was insufficient to cover your fundamental expenses, so you were at a deficit, then these monies came in with a real potential to offset some of that structural deficit, maybe heal some of the wound, or at least delay the inevitable. But what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is you had to implement some additional and different strategies. The professional development you talked about for distance learning is a good example. And I'm just thinking about custodial. Your cleaning strategies, the equipment necessary for cleaning and temperature checking and desk wipe downs and PPEs. Is that an accurate depiction of the different kinds of things you had to do?
Those are many of the different things. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of the school year, we had 2.5 days that were dedicated just to getting staff ready for distance learning, whether it was the social emotional components of, addressing students' needs, across Zoom, or whether it was teaching teachers how to really build robust instructional programs over a computer and learning how to connect on Zoom, Google Classroom. We spend an awful lot of time making sure that teachers before the school year even started had the technology that they needed to be ready. So yes, very new and substantially different.
And so CARES Act was a real blessing because rather than having to further deplete your general fund, your discretionary general fund dollars, you were able to substitute to some extent these CARES Act dollars to supplement what you're doing with your general fund dollars.
That is correct.
Perfect.
Couple of other budgets on this page. The first one, this is the governor's, one of the two governor's funds. In that category, what you see is we had new and substantially different work for some of our teachers, particularly with prep. Our PPEs, so we've spent well over $1.3 million so far in PPEs. We've put some in different funds. We've billed them back to different funds just because it's been a more effective way to do it, so that you can see that PPEs are here also. As a matter of fact, some of the PPE expenses, we've purchased more than 6,000 hand sanitizers. We have more than 25,000 masks right now that are on order. We have more than 300,000 that we already know of here in the district. We have sprayers that have sped up the cleaning of surfaces. We have more than 13,000 plexiglass shields that promote physical distancing. Again, all of these expenses are directly tied to CARES Act stipulations. They've been reviewed by our auditor, and again, they have provided relief for the district. That bottom fund there, Resource 7420, there was $2.3 million, again, that was part of this tied to our learning continuity plan. We had proposed a year ago laying off more than 20 custodians. We knew that once we had CARES Act funds, we would be able to back off on that. And we knew that there would be certainly different work for them to do this year responding to the pandemic. Our instructional aides have had substantially different work this year. They've been responding to distance learning. We have moved our summer school program online, and there were certainly different technology licenses that we needed in order to work on credit recovery and to make sure that our students could connect. The last fund that you see on this slide, we've been assigned $4.47 million worth of ESSER. We're calling this ESSER 1. There's another version of ESSER that is going to come out. The number hasn't been finalized. We have not seen any of those funds yet. So we're just talking about ESSER 1. It was announced last summer. And this has allowed us to purchase Chromebooks, to assist school sites with devices. Without students present on campuses, we've shifted the work for the transportation assistants so that we didn't have to lay any of them off. Really what we've done is try to make sure that we could best meet the needs of students by finding new and substantially different work. And you see a lot of what that is right here. So we're going to tie this up in just a second, but I do want to remind everybody that if you've got questions, please go ahead and send those to cbo@mdusd.org. I think we're done with the big pieces here. Is there anything you think that we've missed in trying to best explain CARES Act to our community?
I don't think you've missed anything. I think you've done a very thorough job of explaining the kinds of money and how the monies have been spent. I think what's important for the electorate to understand and your community to understand is that Mount Diablo had a structural budget deficit. That's a structural problem in the budget prior to the pandemic ever being introduced. The state's revenue was not great. And I will say, while the state frequently says we're giving more money than ever to schools, they are. I'm not going to say they're being dishonest. They are. But it is not keeping pace with the cost of living that you cited in an earlier slide. So the district is falling behind her, if you will. Sounds like something out of a children's book. And the CARES Act has been a real blessing in stemming that decline or that falling behind trend, but not eliminating it. And so for this 1 year, yes, you had an infusion of new dollars, one-time dollars that have been well spent. The unfortunate truth is next year, which is really this year because you're developing your budget for this next year already, and Assembly Bill 1200 requires you to project for 3 years and justify that you're solvent for those 3 years. That same trend we were working on right before the pandemic hit still exists. And it's still the fundamental challenge to your district's fiscal position. And so you've done a great job explaining what CARES Act has done for you, and the heavy lifting is still before us to resolve that structural deficit problem.
Thanks, Mike. We hope that we've answered many of your questions. I appreciate all the emails that have come in. Thank you very much. Hope that you'll pass this information on and perhaps be able to address other questions that you have in the future. See you next week. Bye-bye.